Hello, and welcome to this television series which we call Soviet Battles. This is episode 10, and the tide is turning. Russian forces saw a weakness in the German armies encircling Stalingrad, and with full force and under the code name Operation Uranus, they broke through the encircling German forces.
By the late autumn of 1942, it had become clear to the world that the decision at Stalingrad would have far-reaching consequences for both Russia and Germany. The Red Army soldiers under General Bremenko had held their shrinking perimeter with extraordinary courage. On the other hand, the Nazis had shown no signs of relaxing their pressure. The Red Army command post had been encircled by flames more than once. The Nazis were only 300 yards away. A German lieutenant wrote, "Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day there is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It's a blast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames." In this inferno, the Soviet soldiers fought on, outnumbered. By the time November came, the Soviet troops in Stalingrad had been isolated for 2 months. It was a place that turned a novice into a veteran overnight. At the beginning of the winter in 1942, von Paulus's 6th Army was stuck fast. The Nazis had been lucky that summer. Less so in November, and December to January was the time of reckoning. The defenders of Stalingrad had survived assault after massive assault by the Nazis. It was time for a counterstrike. Supreme Commander Stalin approved the plan conceived by Zhukov and Vasilevsky, in conjunction with Marshal of Artillery Voronov. The Soviet High Command called their plans Uranus. General Vatutin was to command the southeastern front, General Rokossovsky the Don front, General Bremenko and his political advisor Nikita Khrushchev the Stalingrad front. In overall control were Zhukov and Vasilevsky. Zhukov had made his preparations without the Germans' knowledge. Ten armies, over 1 million soldiers, 1,500 tanks, 15,000 pieces of artillery from the Soviet reserves in Siberia, the Urals and Kazakhstan, everything had been amassed without the Nazis' knowledge. A Nazi general said later, earlier there had been nothing there. All of a sudden, a heavy strike was delivered of decisive importance. It was an operation on an unprecedented scale. It was a simple concept. A coordinated drive against the Romanian armies on von Paulus's flank to pin his 6th Army against the Volga. The dawn of November the 19th was damp and foggy over Stalingrad. At 6:30 a.m., weary Soviets in their strongholds heard the rumble of a distant thunder. Vatutin and Rokossovsky had opened their assault on the northwest. The Soviets crushed through the Romanians without a pause, forcing a breach 50 miles wide. Rokossovsky and Vatutin began to move to the south. The next day, the 20th of November, Eremenko's army lunged forward south of Stalingrad, overwhelming the Nazis' defenses, and created an opening 30 miles across. Within the wreckage of the city stood the Soviet 62nd Army. They could hear the guns drawing near. Mile by mile, yard by yard, they reclaimed the ruined buildings they had lost in the previous 125 days. Before the afternoon of November the 23rd, 4 days after they started the offensive, the Soviet armies met. Trapped inside the ring were 22 Nazi divisions, infantry and panzers, 300,000 men. There was no way out for General von Paulus. The Germans tried a massive airlift. It failed. The Soviets claimed 1,000 Nazi planes had been shot down. On the day the ring closed around Stalingrad, von Manstein took over an attempt to relieve von Paulus's army. He had scraped together whatever units were available and tried to stabilize the crumbling front. The plan was for the Panzer Army and General Foch to drive to the Stalingrad perimeter, where von Paulus would break out to meet him. Von Foch's attack was enveloped short of Stalingrad. By December the 21st, 1942, von Manstein's armour was moribund and the mass of his infantry, nearly 250,000 men, had been written off. Von Paulus made no attempt to break out of Stalingrad. His 6th Army was the largest single concentration of the Wehrmacht in the east. The day after completing the encirclement, the Soviets tripled their firepower around Stalingrad. On the 8th of January, the Soviets made an offer of surrender, guaranteeing life and including permission to wear military insignia. Von Paulus rejected the offer. By Christmas time, the Germans in Stalingrad had eaten their horses. They got 1 slice of bread a day. A daily issue of ammunition was 20 to 30 cartridges a man. The situation of the 6th Army was hopeless. 2 days later, on the 10th of January, the Red Army attacked from the west to give aid to the 62nd Army still fighting from its bunkers on the Volga bank. It took them some days of intense fighting, of the kind the 62nd Army had been engaged in for months before they reached their comrades. At last they came to the tractor plant. Some of the most savage battles of the entire war had been fought around and inside it. They were the cream of the German army. Until now, they had only known the taste of victory. The last phase of the Stalingrad battle had been as bitter as the rest. 2 weeks of hand-to-hand encounters among the fire-blackened stones. It started on the eve of the 10th anniversary of Hitler's regime. Pocket after pocket was surrendered. General Daniel gave himself up to General Tolbukin. The Soviets put the figure of German dead since the encirclement at 200,000. The prisoners numbered 95,000. No fewer than 24 generals were included, and 1 field marshal, von Paulus. On January the 31st, von Paulus surrendered. Von Paulus was asked for identification. Von Paulus was asked for identification. He produced his soldier's ID card. Indecisive, remote, moody, von Paulus was something of a tragic figure. He had been one of the authors of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. At Nuremberg, he testified against fascism and the regime he had served. At that time in Stalingrad, in an area held by von Paulus, there was a camp for Soviet prisoners of war. When the Red Army liberated it, the survivors said there had been 2,000 men in the camp only a few weeks before. Now only 20 were alive. The rest had died of starvation, sickness, and torture. General Otto Schmidt, von Paulus's chief of staff, was the only one of von Paulus's officers to remain an unrepentant Nazi throughout his years in a Soviet camp. In 1960, by then a prosperous designer in Hamburg, Schmidt still had no regrets. There were Germans, Romanians, Italians, Hungarians. The wreckage of the huge army, tens of thousands of them shambling through the snowdrifts. It was time after the battle to celebrate survival. The end of the Battle of Stalingrad was also observed in Berlin. Like some gigantic firestorm, the battle had sucked in everything in its vicinity. 800,000 men had died. Under the Russian counterstrike, the German armies in the south had only just escaped annihilation. Hitler's best hopes for victory over the Soviet Union had been extinguished. In Stalingrad itself, they began the long road to recovery. But first, they congratulated themselves. The Nazis and their allies had lost 5 armies, a quarter of the enemy's strength in the Eastern Front. Stalingrad knew it was an inspiration to all who fought against Hitler. Around the world, the victory was recognized for what it was, the turning point of World War II. From that point on in the East, Wehrmacht tactics had to be fundamentally defensive. The Red Army held the initiative. In the Kremlin, Ambassador Harriman presented Stalin with a commemorative scroll signed by President Roosevelt on behalf of the American people. It designated Stalingrad the turning point of the war. British armourers fashioned the Sword of Honour, the gift of King George VI to the people of Stalingrad. Churchill presented it to Stalin at the Tehran conference. It was given to a representative of Stalingrad by Marshal Boudeni. Comrades, the President of the Council of the People's Commissars, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Union, Comrade Stalin has asked me to give you this Sword of Honour, the gift of the British King George VI, to the citizens of Stalingrad in honour of their heroic defence of the city. In London, too, they celebrated. Anthony Eden, Foreign Secretary. Never before in its long history has the German army sustained such an unmitigated disaster as the Red Army has inflicted upon it in the Battle of Stalingrad. Hitler has been outgeneraled, outmaneuvered, and outfought. We had one other additional bit of good news lately of which I hope you all took careful note. It was with a feeling of deep relief that we all read that Hitler is to continue to control the German war machine. The defenders of Stalingrad, the victors of Stalingrad, rested briefly and then moved on toward the front, now well over 100 miles to the west. They would fight other battles, but none as hard as the one they had just finished. It was safe to leave their shelters now, safe for civilians to take over the battlefield that had once been their homes. There was not much left that was familiar. At the Tehran conference, Churchill suggested to Stalin that the city should be left just as it was, a terrible monument, forever. But the Soviet people needed the city to live in again. And they did so, after years and years of labor. A living testament on the banks of Mother Volga. They were the children of war, many without homes, all security stripped away from them by the outbreak of war. Lone, silent, uncomprehending. There was danger everywhere. Mines, booby traps, live ammunition, unexploded bombs. They could not yet begin to clear the debris. They warned each other to give things time to recover. A note on the wall reads, "Mother, we're alive. Gone to Beketovka. Klava." One of the most important services was the mail. Neighbors, families, friends had been scattered by the Nazi onslaught. Now the messages arrived and were re-establishing the old ties. The familiar sounds of life returned. A voice on the telephone, radio speakers, horns in the street. The rattle of trams and the clatter of children going to school, or as much of the school as remained. Nazis would have no further use for this. The Soviets would have use for that. The tractor plant. Thousands had died here, on both sides, fighting. Within a month, the plant returned to peaceful use, re-equipped. The plant sent out its first tractors to the newly liberated areas. More than a generation later, the tractors were still rolling out of Stalingrad. From all over the Soviet Union, aid and comfort poured into Stalingrad. It was as if everyone in the Soviet Union was a citizen of that proud city. Groups of young communists came to help the reconstruction, living in makeshift accommodation. Music came back into people's lives. They set about the task with all their energy, and the city began to grow. Death came swiftly in Stalingrad. The mourning lasts forever. In the summer of 1943, the tanks of the Red Army and Hitler's panzers met head-on